In this video, we're making 1-inch blocks with magnets for modular city and ruins terrain. Last Paradiso craft was modular city terrain tiles, quite large and chunky, good for quickly building out big areas of terrain, but I'd like to get a little more granular now, so once I lay out the big pieces, I can go back in and fine-tune the geometry. Several people remarked on the last video that the terrain reminded them of Final Fantasy Tactics, which, while not intended, is a very welcome comparison. I love the design and look of that game, from characters to environment. Alright, let's cut some foam. I'll be doing this on a Proxxon hot wire table. This thing is really useful for foam work. I'd say it's nearly essential for modular terrain. Modular terrain demands pretty precise cuts if you want everything to fit together. The sides of this offcut have no straight edges, so we'll have to make some. This bit I'm pushing up against the fence is the closest it has to a straight edge. So I take out a speed square and hold it against that approximate edge, then press it against the fence, making sure the square is both securely held against the foam and flush with the fence. Then I run it through the hot wire to get a nice clean cut. Next, I hold the speed square against that cut and flush to the fence again, and we can straighten out this rough edge. Checking it with the speed square here, we can see that we've got a nice right angle. A note about the foam. This is Foamular brand XPS insulation foam, available in the US. It's nice for this project because it's 1 inch thick, so that dimension is basically pre-cut. That said, always double check your foam thickness. There's often some variation in how thick it really is. In my case, this chunk is actually pretty spot on. Okay, now I'll use this square to get the fence 1 inch away from the wire. Just like that. And I don't need the speed square for this step, I just hold one of the flat, squared edges against the fence and run it through. Depending on what part of the world you live in, you may have access to different kinds of XPS. In some parts of Europe, for example, you can get nicer, denser foam in more thicknesses. Denser foam takes textures and impressions better, but for our purposes, this stuff works fine. Now, in the other dimension, this flat edge is quite small, which makes the piece wobbly and hard to move along the fence while maintaining a right angle. So, back to the speed square. And with a few cuts, we've got some cubes, which you can see are 1 inch in all dimensions. And now we can cut up the rest of that offcut. And we've got a nice little heap of cubes. Here's how the magnetization is going to work. 3 sides sharing a corner are going to have magnets with the same polarity facing out. I'll mark that here in blue. You can see they're all next to each other, surrounding this corner. The other 3 sides, sharing the opposite corner, will have the opposite polarity. I'll mark those in red. So here you can see how the magnets will be arranged. 3 surrounding this corner, and there it is. 3 surrounding this corner, and 3 surrounding that corner. This arrangement means that if I mark one of these 2 corners, the orientation of the whole block can be derived from that. So with the craft knife, I'll cut the red corners on all the blocks. So when they're all textured and painted up, I can easily orient them. By the way, this whole project is inspired by the magnetic block design from the RP Archive channel. Marking the corners this way is my variation on the design. So you can see here on this cube that I haven't marked with dots, all I need is that 1 corner cut to know where all of the magnets go. This is a little magnet jig, some pieces of wood stuck together, with a thumbtack poked through, and a bit of styrene tube glued on top of the point. You can see that these sides are both 1 inch, and the thumbtack is dead center. The styrene tube is 3 millimeters diameter, same as the magnets I'll be using. Punching magnet holes is quite straightforward. Just line the block up with the corner, and poke a hole in each side. And that's it, ready for magnets. And we repeat that for all the cubes. These are 2 magnet orientation sticks. I got them with a pack of magnets, but honestly, you should just make your own by gluing magnets in opposite orientations to the ends of color-coded sticks. That's all these are. Their purpose is to help insert magnets in the right orientation. Here are the magnets I'll be using. They're 3x2mm N52 neodymium disc magnets. Little guys, but very strong for their size, like ants. So with a little dab of hot glue, in it goes. Hot glue is messy and kind of annoying, but it sets fast, and it works well with foam. I'm using the SureBonder Pro glue sticks for this. I think they make a somewhat better bond than the regular stuff. For gluing foam pieces to each other, I'd just stick with the regular hot glue sticks, though. The magnets benefit from a little extra holding power. You don't want them popping out on you. So here you can see I put 3 magnets using the red stick around this cut corner, which means the other 3 will use the blue stick. Oop, get back in there. And here's a couple cubes, and they'll just snap together. You can see from the notches that they're in the same orientation. Obviously they won't snap together in every orientation, but it gives you lots of options. Once all the cubes are magnetized, it's time for texture. This is acrylic modeling paste, which I'm largely using to blend the magnets and hot glue and hide some of the foam grain texture. I spread some with my fingers, but spreading it around with a palette knife helps create a kind of plastered or stucco look. This definitely doesn't need to be totally even, and it doesn't need total coverage either. Some variation is nice. Speaking of variation, let's add some detail to these guys with some carving. The simplest thing to do is to just cut little notches off the edges, but you can also freehand little holes like this, or bigger cutouts like this, or little rectangular shapes like this. For the most part, I'm working around the magnets, leaving them in place so the cubes will snap together in most orientations. While I finish this up, I've got a story for you about small dwarves and big stone blocks. Frthg knew his place in the underhold of Yrrmgrthng, the dwarven castle city carved into the mountain Yrrmg. He knew he was a minor 37, a low but honorable rank, mentoring his lessers and obeying his graders, working his way up in the dwarven tradition. Frthg lived comfortably in the rigid structure of the dwarf underworks, laboring for the good of his people, knowing that 7 short years of toil were all that stood between him and advancement to minor 38. He had only once felt the call to band together with fellow workers, to sum their numbers and call upon their graders to unseat an overseer who had grown negligent in his administration, breaking his oath of stewardship and care for those beneath him. The dwarves of Yrrmgrthng, like many dwarf societies, have numbers, estimates of their positions in the Great Order, sometimes called the Order of Labor, for it is their belief that the organized and coordinated structuring of effort for the benefit of all is the greatest good, and is what separates people from animals. And one's position in this order is determined by dedication to one's craft and the responsibilities one has assumed. So as the dwarves do good work in life, they advance in the order, achieving ever higher numbers, cementing their worth and status for all eternity. Like many dwarven societies in the mortal realm, Yrrmgrthng is structured in an attempt to mirror the Great Order. Dwarven theologians have derived means of estimating one's number and create well-defined paths of numerological advancement. Higher-numbered dwarves, or graders, have power and authority over lower-numbered dwarves, or lessers. But they also have responsibilities and obligations to them. And collectively, in times of need, lessers can band together and sum their numbers to hold their graders to account. Depending on the proportion of the sum of lessers to the number of the grader, different requests or demands may be made, or punishments enforced by dwarven law. One's number in life, however, is understood to only be an estimate. In death, they believe you meet Frthg, god of order, who will sort you into the Great Order by your true number, which only he can divine. As with most dwarves, Frthg, minor 37, only occasionally encountered outsiders, usually merchants, who visited the Underhold. As such, he was only dimly aware of the surface ruler, the Emperor of Ozma, with whom the Thanes, the greatest of graders in Yrrmgrthng, dealt. After one grand delegation from that surface lord arrived, the Thanes announced that an alliance had been arranged, and to enrich the underhold of Yrrmgrthng, a cadre of skilled dwarven laborers would be lent to the Emperor's quarries. And so it was that Frthg left the familiar confines of the underhold for the first time. sent with many other dwarves by their graders to journey with the imperial delegation to a great limestone quarry. Back to the build for some tiling. I really like azulejo-style tile work, so I incorporate it into a lot of my builds. I just lay down a bit of PVA glue where I want the tiles to go, and then carefully place the individual tile pieces, which I cut out of thin card. The card I use is from blank playing cards, but you can use cereal boxes, folders, a bit of packaging, thicker than paper, but not by too much. Most of these tiles I keep to these recessed areas so they won't stick out of the 1-inch cube and cause these pieces to not fit together as nicely, but ultimately I'm not too worried about it. Once the details are done, I like to give the pieces a little coat of Mod Podge mixed with a bit of paint. This acts as a kind of combination base coat and protective layer. Mod Podge is a PVA glue with some kind of varnish mixed in that helps protect pieces that you coat and seals in any stuff that could potentially break off easily, like these little card tiles, flock, modeling paste, or whatever. I decided to do some in white and some in black to see if it'll have an impact on the final result. It doesn't really. I think I prefer black because it looks better in recesses if you happen to not paint over it. And it makes this next step a little nicer. Anyway, time for real priming and painting. I use an airbrush for this. It just makes doing a lot of pieces in a batch more fun and more efficient. If you're a normal person who doesn't have an airbrush, spray paint will work just fine. And the way I'm applying this gray primer over black, you can see I'm not going for full coverage, and I'm not trying to get into the crevices. A bit of contrast here and there helps pick out details, textures, and shadows, which helps me figure out where to apply different shades of paint in future steps. Speaking of which, colors. I'm using an airbrush for the base coats because it's fun and I like the blending I can get. I mix the paints with airbrush medium to thin them out a bit so they'll spray nicely and won't clog up the airbrush. These use the same color scheme as my stairs and city tiles from the previous videos, so if you want a more in-depth look at how these colors work, check those videos out. Here's the quick version though. I start with this flesh tone color for a warmer, more Mediterranean limestone kind of look. Not all stone needs to be shades of gray. I add in subtle hints of orange for extra warmth. When I do shadows, I shift into browns with a hint of purple mixed in. And when I start highlighting, you'll see whites, creams, and a light azure blue. The big difference with how I'm painting these as opposed to the pieces I've done before is that I'm not assuming an orientation. The other pieces have a clear top and bottom, even if they can rotate on the ground plane. The way these are built, they can go in many orientations. So there's no clear top, bottom, or sides. So where I could kind of bake in a light source coming from above when I shaded the other pieces, I can't really do that here. So what do I do instead? I lean even further into the stylized approach I take to light and shadow, focusing on highlighting the edges of each piece and shadowing the recessed parts, like the little notches and holes I've cut out of many of the blocks. This won't result in a directional light effect, but it will help give the impression that light, whatever direction it's coming from, is catching the raised edges and not quite making it into the recesses. Okay, while I continue painting, let's get back to the story. Frthg and the dwarves were assured by the graders that sent them that while the move was irregular, the order of labor would continue to govern them wherever they went. And they would continue to advance in the eyes of Frthg according to their efforts and responsibilities. When traveling with the tall surface folk, the dwarves were shocked to learn they had no numbers. They had been told by their graders that this would be the case, but they hadn't really believed it. They'd also been told to obey their orders despite this, so they did, uncomfortable though it made them. On arrival at the quarry, the dwarves were similarly shocked to find that it was open air, that their digging and cutting would be done in the open, exposed to the elements. Their lodgings, too, would be above-ground structures. Very strange indeed. Housed and working alongside laborers of many other kin, mostly surface dwellers, the dwarves kept mostly to themselves and focused on their work of cutting great blocks of limestone. The one thing in this strange place that was familiar to them. Privately amongst themselves, they would tabulate their labor and estimate numbers as they had learned to do in their underhold home. They also tried to estimate the numbers of those around them, to try and understand the structure of the world they now found themselves in. To this end, Frthg began to reach out to workers of other kin from other regions to try and learn more about them, to better discern their numbers. In time, he began to understand that the Osmonds and other surface dwellers do not self-organize with rational numbers as the dwarves do, but instead use arbitrary-sounding ranks and other signifiers to determine hierarchy and obligation. It seemed a very messy, irrational way of ordering the world. One friend he made, a beardless human named Masha, found his questions and confusion endlessly entertaining. She was an artist, a sculptor of some renown from the great city itself, Ozma, where all the great blocks of stone they were cutting were being sent to build something called a ziggurat, which she sketched for him. As he saw her skill and precision at working the stone, he wondered what she was doing here, working alongside him. She should be a sculptor 42 at least, even though she had the appearance and sometimes the demeanor of a rather elongated dwarven child. Yet even when he told her his estimation of her rank, she continued to treat him as an equal, or at least approximate. One day, he asked her what it was exactly the ziggurat was for. They had no such structures in the underhold he came from. She lowered her voice and said, "Careful, friend. Asking that is what landed me here." When he continued looking at her with an uncomprehending expression, she sighed. "It's the Emperor's project, Emperor Pellas, who builds greatness. We're building his greatness. That's what it's for." The Emperor. "I'd been meaning to ask," started Frthg. "Oh, here we go," she laughed. "What would his number be?" "We're down in this pit, and you're wondering about the Emperor's number?" Ooh, heads down. Their overseer marched by, shouting at some other workers. Once he'd gone, Frthg looked over to his friend. "If you don't mind my saying so, it just seems like you shouldn't be here. It seems unjust. Your great skill would be put to much better use elsewhere. It's all just so inefficient. I ask after the Emperor's number because I wish to know what sum of us we would need to amass to petition him, or make a demand even. I've done such a thing once before, my fellow miners and I. Surely not to one so great as the Emperor, but still, with a sum of 453, we were able to make our petition heard and our grievances redressed." "Frthg, you're sweet, but it doesn't work like that on the surface. Think of the Emperor's number as uncountable. It's maybe a divine number, for he's said to be ordained by the gods." Frthg furrowed his brow. "That's very disturbing to me," he whispered. "To claim a divine number for a mortal is heresy. Your Emperor says he builds when it is us building. Your Emperor says he is elevated to the heavens when he walks the earth. Your Emperor claims a divine number given by gods when no number can be given. Every number must be earned with labor. The surface world is a world of madness." Masha leaned back against one of the great stone blocks and wiped sweat from her brow, smiling, but with no joy in her eyes. "Now you're getting it, Frthg. Back to it. Okay, I'm not loving all the roughness in the gaps between stones on this piece, so I'm using a bit of spackle to fill them in. Doing this on top of paint might not be ideal, but we can get most of the spackle that's not in the cracks off with a wet brush and towel. And we'll let that dry. Okay, so now I want to add a little visual texture to these pieces, and start in on the highlighting. As I've mentioned before, this is where I start mixing in whites and light blue to the flesh tone base. I just use a piece of parchment paper as a palette, and a bit of sponge to apply the paint in a splotchy, random kind of way. I don't want too much paint on the sponge, because I don't want this to overwhelm the paint from previous steps. And I don't want the sponge to be too wet, because I don't really want this paint to flow on the piece. I want to keep the random texture of the sponge to help sell the impression of mottled stone. We can also use the sponge to blend these highlight colors with the base stone colors without worrying about brush strokes showing up on the pieces. For edge highlighting, I'm using the same colors, just with more of the white mixed in. This is not dry brushing. I'm just loading up some paint on the brush and carefully hitting just the most prominent edges. I always say this, but it's true. Edge highlighting is the step where these pieces really come together. I've found that with any creative project, drawing, painting, sculpting, game design, videos, whatever, there's always a stretch of time where it really feels like you're screwing everything up. Nothing looks good, and it's hard to tell if it's going to come together in the end. One of the most savage insults I've heard is saying that someone looks like the middle of an Animorphs book cover transformation. Unfortunately, that's what making things is kind of like. You start with something recognizable, raw materials, an idea, and you're trying to turn that into something else that's recognizable, a piece of art. But in the middle, it's just kind of a muddled mess. It's no longer what it was, and it's not really recognizable as what you want it to become. I've heard this referred to as the Valley of Despair, but I don't really like that term. I think it says too much about how you react to it, and not enough about the experience itself. Despair can certainly come up, especially on large, complex projects that a lot of time and resources have gone into, but despair doesn't really help you finish what you started. What I like to think about at this stage of a project is intent. A lot of the reason things don't look great is not because of poor technique or execution, but because they're not cohesive. They don't look intentional. And that's what I find edge highlights do here. They take the kind of amorphous, blotchy color scheme on the pieces and introduce some clear intent to them. Especially when I vary the highlight color to reflect the base colors around it. A little warmer in warmer areas, a little brighter in bright areas, and all of a sudden those base colors start to feel like, yeah, they're supposed to be there. And that's the turning point. I can follow that intent, lean into it, tighten it up, help it cohere, and once you see what it's becoming, that confidence and joy starts coming back. Speaking of joy, I'm going to take a quick moment here to thank all the wonderful people who support my work here on YouTube and as members of my site, paradiso.zone. Your support makes these videos possible and helps me keep the lights on while I'm working on my various projects. If you enjoy these videos and have a few bucks to spare, I'd really love your support as a paid member of my website, paradiso.zone, where you get my newsletter and a bunch of tabletop game materials as rewards. Or if you prefer, you can become a paid subscriber on YouTube and get early access to Paradiso Craft videos as well as subscriber-only videos. And if you can't afford that right now, I get it. A like, a subscribe, a comment, all do wonders for helping this channel grow and become sustainable. One last thing before getting back to the video. I'm in the middle of a Kickstarter campaign for my new RPG book, The Blades of Gixa. It's a mega dungeon for old-school tabletop RPGs, a place you could theoretically set an entire campaign in. I pretty much improvised it, a room at a time, day by day for a year-ish, as part of Sean McCoy's Dungeon 23 challenge. I have a bunch of videos about that too on the channel. I'll be publishing it as a book and a set of poster art prints. It's gonna be sick. Head over to paradiso.oo/Gixa to check it out. As of launching this video, there's only a few days left on the Kickstarter, so now's the time to get over there. And if you're watching this a bit further in the future, don't worry. This link will take you to the pre-order page after the campaign, or if you're even further in the future, it'll take you to a store page where you can buy the book. Okay, thank you so much. Let's get back to the video. Now we can further lighten things up and pick out details with dry brushing. Dry brushing is a very simple and easy technique. You take a somewhat wider brush and just get a bit of your highlight color on it. In this case, a mix of flesh, white, and maybe a touch of azure, and then wipe most of it off the brush so there's just a bit of paint left. You then lightly drag the brush across the surface of the piece, and this small amount of paint will catch just on the raised areas, highlighting all your lovely textures and details. This is basically the opposite of a wash. A wash is very wet, so it rolls off the prominent areas and seeps into the deepest recesses. For dry brushing, you want your brush to be nearly dry, so the paint will not flow at all once it's on the piece. Dry for surfaces, wet for crevices. Speaking of washes, earlier in the painting process, I painted some shadows in the deepest holes, cracks, and recesses, and now I want to emphasize those, but also take a more all-over approach to further help the little textural details pop out. And the quickest, most straightforward way to do this is with a wash. A wash is just paint, thinned down to the point that it has low enough viscosity to spread with capillary action and seep into crevices. You can do this with acrylic paint and water, but oil paint thinned with mineral spirits is really nice for this. Oil paint takes a much longer time to dry, which means by using an oil wash, you have much more working time for spreading it around, dabbing it off, whatever you want to do. You could use oil paint for everything really, but I find the quick drying time of acrylics is actually an asset most of the time. I work mostly in layers, so I usually want my paint to dry quickly so I can get to the next layer as soon as possible. At some point, I also mix in some crimson oil wash to get more purpley warmth in the crevices. And as you can see, I'm using my gloved finger as I go to wipe the wash off the raised areas, really showing off that texture. Okay, going back to the tiles and a second round of edge highlights. The brown wash works wonders for picking out texture, but it does tend to darken everything a bit. The tiles especially need brightening. These highlights are even brighter than before, going mostly with an off-white, still with little dabs of azure and flesh. And while I do that, let's get back to the story. Months passed, and the ranks of laborers swelled at the quarry, even as conditions worsened. Rations were restricted, working hours lengthened, and they were no longer let outside of the camp. The dwarves knew they were obligated to be here by the promises of their graders, but now they began to feel like prisoners. As more kin from far-off lands were brought to the camp, the dwarves learned more about their different ways, and did their best to help them, as they had been helped to acclimate to life here. The new workers brought with them news from outside. The tidings were dark. The Emperor was constantly furious, claiming obstruction and sabotage of his great ziggurat project, and insubordination by a recalcitrant parliament, which he had since dissolved by imperial edict. Some of the new workers were, in fact, former parliamentarians themselves. Many more were farmers, shepherds, field hands, now conscripted into service, cutting blocks from the quarry to be sent to the masons in the city. Many of the empire's fields lay fallow, and the people had begun to feel the ache of chronic hunger. Those coming from Ozma said there were riots in the streets, revolts, and uprisings, but they had been brutally crushed by the Emperor's guard. Frthg heard one night that his friend Masha had been badly injured by a falling rock. He went to see her, pushing through crowds of other workers to a cot in the overcrowded dormitory. As she lay there, haphazardly bandaged and in pain, he held her calloused hand. Outside, he could hear shouts as fellow workers scuffled with guards, demanding help, a healer. But they were pushed back and beaten. Frthg wept into his beard. Why? Why won't they help you? Their lessers are their responsibilities. You are their responsibility. If this world were sane, they would see that it is their duty to help you. She looked up at him. My friend, I'm afraid you'll have to forget about your numbers. Your great order of labor won't serve you well up here. Perhaps you and I have glorious numbers in the eyes of your God. I expect I shall learn mine soon. But you have to understand, here, to our masters, we are zeros. No sum of us can amount to anything. Back to the build, and then we'll conclude the story. Okay, and as usual, we end the painting process with details. Here we have some moss, which started with a darker green base, and gradually works its way up with layers of drybrushing to a brighter and yellower green. I also like to blend the green with the rest of the piece a little bit, getting some of it on the stone. There are some small metal bits on a couple pieces, so I'm going to paint those with a slightly darkened silver, just a touch of black mixed in. And then I like to go in with a bit of orange, just to give them a little hint of rust. So, those little tiles I added, I want them to feel like decorative azulejo tiles, like you find in Portugal. They're usually blue and white, with intricate designs, which I'll be freehanding an approximation of. I can only really get so detailed here. I'm more concerned with giving the impression of intricate designs than actually producing them. You can see my pinky finger on my brush hand pressing on the piece when I'm painting. I'm doing this to stabilize my hand. Not that my hands are particularly shaky, but it's very hard to maintain a precise position with a hand that's just floating in space. These do not by any means have to be perfect. Much more important is consistency. This comes down to intent again. If you can recognize a pattern repeating across multiple tiles, even if each individual tile is a somewhat sloppy rendition of that pattern, the overall effect comes through, and we see what it evokes rather than what it literally is. And now to our story's conclusion. Frthg and some of the others managed to smuggle Masha out of the camp to some sympathetic farmers who promise to hide her while she hopefully recovers. But as camp security tightens, they lose contact with them and know nothing of what becomes of her. As the months stretch on, conditions only worsen. A terrible accident claims the lives of several of Frthg's kin. The rest of them are made to keep working as the bodies are hauled off to be dumped unceremoniously into growing mass graves. Their kin could give them no last rites, so Frthg and the other dwarves begin chanting funeral dirges as they work. The other workers soon learn the sounds, even if they do not speak the tongue, and join them as they toil and lament. The dwarven funeral songs echo throughout the quarry, day and night. These are the conditions they labor under when the Emperor himself, Pellas, who builds greatness, visits the quarry to inspect it, to look for inefficiencies in the production of stone for his great ziggurat. But as he and the overseers look out on the great pit and heatedly discuss ways to improve production, the Emperor becomes distracted by the eerie dirge. He turns to the overseers and demands to know what it is he's hearing. They tell him the laborers have working songs to keep spirits high and coordinate their efforts, but after an accident that killed several dwarves, they will only sing this one. A song for their dead, the Emperor spits. He steps out to the lip of the quarry and bellows out, demanding silence. As quiet falls, he shouts, "I am your Emperor, Pellas, who builds greatness. And you sing of death as you work? How dare you? You poison the very stones you send to Ozma, to me, with this sickening lament. No, you sing in my honor. You chant my name, so you do not forget why you are here. So every last stone is blessed with my radiance." Silence greets his proclamation. Then a voice begins the dirge again, and other voices join in. And before the Emperor can call out again, someone in the quarry looses a sling, and a small chunk of limestone cracks against the Emperor's head. Losing his balance and tipping over the edge before his guards can catch him, he falls into the quarry, into the open arms of the workers below, who pin him to the wall as Frthg runs a mattock through his skull. The guards leap down upon the workers, running Frthg through and slaughtering those around him. It's said hundreds died in the quarry massacre, but a few did escape that day. In the ensuing tumult that gripped the Empire, the few remaining dwarves managed to find Masha in the keep of a relative who had been searching for her since she'd been arrested and banished to the quarry. She'd survived and had been slowly recovering, though she would live with a limp the rest of her days. Hearing from the dwarves what transpired at the quarry after they smuggled her out, she wept for the cruelty they'd endured and for the loss of her friend, Frthg. They told her of his planning and his leadership, her account of which is the source of this tale. Word had reached the workers in advance of the Emperor's visit, and Frthg had them sharpen their tools and create makeshift slings in anticipation. They told her what he said to them. I understand now, with the death of my brothers, with the callousness and uncaring of our graders, what our dear friend Masha told me. If the Emperor's number is indeed infinite, then we may as well be zeros. No number of us can sum to an influence over one who claims infinity. But in life, our numbers can only be the mere guesses of mortals, and in death, by the judgment of Frthg, we learn our true place in the Great Order. So, when faced with a man claiming infinite authority in life, a sum no others can hope to reach, what is left for the rest of us to do but hasten the coming of his day of judgment? The ziggurat was never finished. The stone blocks cut for it, scattered and repurposed across the great city of Ozma. And though the annals record the reign of the Emperor Pallas who builds greatness, he is remembered colloquially as Emperor Pallas who spills blood to build nothing. And that's our story. Let's finish these blocks. This next bit is a new experiment for me. I'm using a stencil technique to put markings on some of the pieces. To do this, I'm marking out shapes with masking tape. Washi tape, actually. I'm out of regular masking tape. Being careful to ensure that they're squared up, evenly spaced from the edges, and so on. I also have this ridiculous 1mm thin tape from Tamiya to add some detail. Then I dab on little bits of masking fluid to prevent paint from getting onto random spots, so it'll hopefully look like the paint has worn or chipped away. Masking fluid dries to a rubbery consistency, so you can paint over it and then peel off the mask, revealing whatever's underneath. There's not much of a logic to these markings. They're just geometric shapes that are perhaps used by some municipal agency or organization to label or demarcate different areas in the city. On most of these, I wished I had gone further with the paint. They wound up being a little too faint for my liking. So I went back and hand retouched a bunch of them, adding a bit more opacity. I have to say, it was very satisfying to pull off the masking fluid. I'd say this experiment was not 100% successful, but that's okay. In the end, I liked how they looked. And this kind of masking technique is something I definitely plan to explore further. Once everything dries, it's time to protect the pieces with varnish. These are going to get picked up and moved around a lot after all. Gloss varnish is supposed to be the most durable kind, so I'm using that initially. But I don't want these to be super shiny, so when the gloss cures, I go over them again with a matte varnish. This gives them a really nice, flat, even look when it dries. And here's how they all turned out. First, on their own, you can see how they're very modular and can be combined to make all kinds of blocky shapes. But the actual way I want to use them is in combination with my other pieces from previous videos. The city tiles in particular form the foundation of my layouts, and now I can add in these blocks to fill in gaps, create walls, columns, and obstacles, and just generally tweak and alter the shape of the terrain. Thanks again to all my supporters, who you can join at paradiso.zone. And don't forget to check out my Kickstarter for the Blades of Gixa at paradiso.oo/Gixa. It's only running for another few days, unless you're a bit further in the future, in which case that link will take you to a pre-order or shop page. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks for your support.